Richard Ackerman, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be on the show.
It is my pleasure to have you. And if people don't recognize that name, they probably will recognize your YouTube name, Redeemed Zoomer. I meant to check before we started this, but your videos have received millions of views, especially the ones in which you compare denominations. And you describe yourself on your Instagram as from leftist to Christian. That's like your little bio there at the top. And so I'd be curious
Yeah.
just to get to know you a little bit because people might have seen your videos, but they might not know you individually quite as much. What is your story? Tell me, flesh out from leftist to Christian for me a little bit.
All right, cool. Thanks for asking. So, my leftist background is kind of because I'm from New York. I went to New York public school for 13 years, and it doesn't really have much to do with my parents. They were spiritual and stuff, but it was really the just the community, the school, the whole environment that raised me as a leftist, basically. I couldn't fathom how anyone could not be a secular leftist. I thought religion was very anti-scientific. So growing up, that was kind of my mindset. I thought I was told just by the general community, by the zeitgeist of my time, that conservative Christians are bad people that are trying to hold back society. And all of that changed when I went to a summer camp in the Midwest. It was a classical music camp, one of those regular music festivals, if you guys do classical music. But it had a Christian theme. It was run by a Christian viola professor. And I saw the goodness, truth, and beauty of Christianity there. And then I went back home. I saw the nastiness, lies, and ugliness of secular leftism. That really moved me to become a Christian. I did become a Christian after that, and it took me several years after that to deconstruct my leftist beliefs that I was raised with. It happened a lot with clashes I had once my Christianity clashed with the beliefs of my peers and stuff. Christianity kind of put the nail in the coffin of my social life in high school, but ended up being a lot more sanctified because of that, and I'm grateful to God that I was put through that. So yeah, my the reason I call myself from leftist to Christian is because I saw so many of my friends, including some of my summer camp friends who helped me convert. I saw so many people go from Christian to leftist. So many, young ladies take the Bible verse out of their bio and replace it with pronouns. So my name from leftist to Christian was to show that that process can go in reverse, like it did for me. So that's my background basically.
I appreciate that. That's helpful. And I think it might be interesting just to get your perspective on what you mean by this. Because leftist as a term, I think, could mean a lot of different things to a lot of
Right.
people.
I
When
should
you're
have. I
using
should have.
that term, I should ask you to define it. So we're all good. But when you
Yeah.
say leftist, what do you mean by that?
Right. So I usually clarify this. I don't know why I forgot just now. It has nothing to do with politics. Nothing at all. I could honestly care less about that. It's a worldview. It's a religion, basically. It's a religion just like any religion. Leftism has orthodoxy and heresy. When I first converted to Christianity, I was kind of a heretical leftist at the time. I was a leftist who did not subscribe to the gender ideology, for example, even though I was a leftist in every other way. So I was sort of like the Arius of leftism at that time, sort of like the J.K. Rowling. So because I realized leftism was a religion, I realized it couldn't be compatible with Christianity. So the religious values of leftism has nothing to do with who you vote for or what your economic policies are. It has to do with do you think there should be order in terms of sexuality and gender and all that? Do you think we are entitled to stuff, or do you think we are dependent on God? Do you think we should focus on obsessing over ourselves, or should we focus on serving others? Those are kind of the clashes between leftism and Christianity, just as worldviews. And generally speaking, with almost no exceptions, when I saw someone drift into the leftist worldview, they would always drift away from Christianity. So this is not about politics. It's about religion, it's about culture, it's about society, but it's not about politics.
That's fascinating. We could have an entire discussion about this, and perhaps some will be disappointed that that's not going to be the focus of our conversation today. But I think it's an interesting kind of starting place for people to get to know you and kind of what you're about in some ways. But what I'm specifically interested in your work is that I came to know you through your desire to revive mainline churches, which to me is an interesting kind of like hill that you've carved out to die on, if you will. Like this is one thing that the Protestant church really needs, and so I'd be curious. Talk to me a bit about when did you kind of come to this conviction, or how did you come to the conviction that the way forward for Protestantism is not to abandon the main line and to kind of go with the evangelical surge, but to actually revive the kind of struggling mainline churches in the U.S.?
Right. So it kind of started just once I became Christian, because as long as I've been a Christian, I've been a mainline Protestant. The summer camp where I converted, which was a very good place, it's where I saw the goodness, truth, and beauty of Christianity. It was, loosely associated just with mainline Protestant churches. Most of the staff members were part of mainline churches. I think this is partly because mainline Protestant churches have a disproportionate number of classical musicians. So we would always do, community service at that camp, working with some sort of local Methodist church or something, or we would play a concert at a local Presbyterian church. So when I decided to convert to Christianity, I wanted to convert to a Christianity that was basically the same kind as my summer camp. So I just chose my local mainline PCUSA Presbyterian church. And at first, I had no idea what the problems with the mainline are. I had no idea what theological liberalism was. I had no idea that the PCUSA was even considered the liberal denomination, because my home church was a more moderate PCUSA congregation. There was no politics in the pulpit. It was just, regular sermons about Jesus and the Bible and stuff. It was a normal church, and I loved it. But after 1 year of me being there, the pastor retired, and he was replaced with this lady pastor from the UCC she did not believe the Bible was the word of God. She did not believe the resurrection was literal. And at first I was trying to say, like, I was interested. I was asking her about her beliefs, and she recommended I look into progressive Christianity, because she openly identified as a progressive Christian. But the more I looked into progressive Christianity, the more I realized this is not Christianity at all. I was like, what I believe is more similar to Roman Catholicism than this weird progressive stuff. So I was like, how are these people even pastors if they don't even believe in God, it seems? And then I did some research, and I found out that the PCUSA, my denomination, was what's called a mainline Protestant denomination. And the mainline Protestant denominations are very much liberal leaning, meaning they have a lot of this progressive Christianity. So what happened at my church, in other words, was not an anomaly. Especially, I noticed how liberal my denomination was when I went on a confirmation retreat that was hosted by my denomination, not by my church. And there was one pastor there who didn't believe Jesus was God. There was another pastor there who called Tim Keller a fundamentalist, another pastor who called unborn children parasites. And once I got back from that trip, I was like, okay, I have to leave this denomination. Maybe I'll go Catholic. Maybe I'll join the PCA or something else. I just have to get out of this. And then my mentor, who was a, Bible-believing Reformed Christian, said, here's the thing. Our denomination, our church was not always like this. Our church is rooted in the most biblical Christianity you could possibly imagine. It's rooted in the Reformation. It's rooted in the Confessions, but it's been hijacked from the outside. And the reason it's gotten this bad is because people keep running away. So you have to not run away. That's what my mentor told me. My mentor told me a sort of proto-Reconquista type thing. But I didn't understand it. I didn't understand why we shouldn't just leave if it was getting this bad. I didn't know what was so important about preserving these old mainline institutions. So for the next few years, I was kind of planning to eventually move to the PCA or something, especially I got a girlfriend who was in the EPC, and I was like, okay, maybe I'll go to that. The PCA, for those of you who don't know, it's a conservative denomination that split off from the mainline Presbyterian denomination because it was getting liberal. The EPC is also a conservative Presbyterian denomination that split off from the mainline because the mainline was getting liberal. So I was sort of planning to do that. But then I noticed a bit of a pattern. I noticed that it was sort of the same deal in the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church is the mainline Anglican church in America that has gotten liberal. So there's the ACNA that split off from that. Or the United Methodist Church is getting liberal. So the Global Methodist Church split off from that. Or the Reformed Church in America is getting liberal. So the Alliance of Reformed Churches split off from that. I began to notice a pattern. Every church split was not actually a split. It was just the conservatives leaving the liberal thing. I began to wonder, why was it never the other way around? Why was it never liberals leaving the conservative denomination? Why was every denomination split a split into original versus conservative? And I began to see the fruits of this when I went down to Texas for school. I saw a lot of these evangelical churches. These evangelical churches, they're conservative, but not traditional. They had very modern buildings. They had a very modern style of worship that was completely alien to me. It sounded just kind of more like a rock concert than what I was used to being church. I noticed there was a weird split of the Protestant churches between churches that were traditional but not conservative, meaning mainline churches, and churches that were conservative but not traditional, meaning evangelical churches. And then I started to study the history of leftism more, and I noticed that all the greatest universities, like the Ivy League schools, for example, we think of them as bastions of leftism now, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, but they were all founded by Bible-believing Christians. And I realized that leftists, secularists, whatever you want to call them, they never actually create any beautiful, enduring institutions. Christians build beautiful, enduring institutions, and leftists hijack them. Christians made Harvard, but Harvard got hijacked. So then Christians split off and made Yale, but then Yale got hijacked. So the conservative Christians split off and made Princeton, but then Princeton got hijacked. And I began to ask myself, when does this end? When are Christians going to stop running away from the institutions that they built? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that, a lot of the anti-intellectualism and disconnect from tradition that exists in evangelical circles can be traced back to the fact that evangelicals have spent the past 100 years doing nothing but running away. So the essence of Reconquista is trying to reverse that process, trying to say that Bible-believing Christians, whether you want to call them conservatives or evangelicals, whatever, Bible-believing Christians have to stop running away, and they have to start retaking the institutions that they built, but leftists took from them. So that's basically where I got the idea of Reconquista from.
That's really interesting. The other day I saw on your Instagram you posted about the Southern Baptist Convention, and there's plenty of controversy around the SBC. But the essence of your post, if I'm getting it correct, was that you wanted to give them credit that while all of the other kind of mainline churches had done exactly what you described, of it had been kind of hijacked by a more theologically liberal group, and then the more conservative group ended up kind of splintering off and creating their own thing, that the SBC had somehow kept control of that. Do you have any thoughts, based on that post, of maybe why it is that it's always the conservatives leaving, and maybe how this one example might help people think about a way that it's possible for it to be otherwise?
Yeah, so why have conservatives always left? That's a historical question. It's always very debatable what historical things led to what. I personally think it's just the fundamentalist movement. The fundamentalist modernist controversy started in the early 20th century, and I think it was two sides of one modernist coin, honestly. So modernists began to take over the churches, and the fundamentalist instinct was just to retreat. And the fundamentalism permeates all areas of society, and it still has a very big influence on conservative Christianity today. The fundamentalist mindset originally was rooted in the expectation that Christ would return in the next few years, and this was like 120 years ago. So the fundamentalist instinct is retreat from the cities, move to the rural areas, start a farm, and have 20 children. The fundamentalist instinct is retreat from the public schools. They're all evil. They're all Satanist or whatever. Retreat from mainstream science. If anyone believes in evolution, they're of the devil. The fundamentalist instinct is also retreat from the mainline churches and start your own thing and hide out in the countryside in a shed somewhere and wait for Jesus to come back. So I think the fundamentalist instinct is really what's behind this. The fundamentalist instinct that I think it almost assumes that Christians are weaker than atheists. They're like, sure, atheists hijacked our institutions, but we can't take them back because, I don't know, we must be weaker than them. It kind of assumes this sort of pessimistic eschatology. It kind of assumes this sort of apocalypse mindset. I don't think this is a conscious thing. I think this was originally the theology of the early fundamentalists, and that just sort of seeped its way into American conservative Christianity as a whole. So I believe a lot of the same things as conservatives, and by conservative, I just mean that, I believe the Bible is the word of God. But I think their strategy is horrible, and I think their strategy is why Christians, conservative Christians, lose every single cultural battle. It's why the culture has gotten less and less religious, because conservative Christians do nothing but run away. Another thing that influenced my thinking, sort of the antithesis of this, dispensational rapture theology, is kingdom theology, which I've learned about from people like N.T. Wright. My church has promoted it a lot. Kingdom theology says that God's kingdom is now. God's kingdom is not in the future, and the job of the church is to spread God's kingdom here on earth and transform the world. And because of kingdom theology, it means the church's institutions, like schools and hospitals and universities, those things actually matter. I like to think of different denominations as different provinces of the kingdom of God, all transforming the world in a sort of a unique way. And if the job of the church is to be the kingdom of God here on earth, if heaven is colonizing earth through the church, then things like historic institutions and beautiful buildings and, church choirs, all these things that evangelicals shun as, materialist Catholic things, no, those actually matter because those are ways in which the church is transforming the world.
I think you anticipated my next question, because a follow-up I wanted to bring up, and maybe we can continue hashing it out a little bit, is that one of the premises kind of underlining this seems to be that the battle over the culture is one that Christians should be engaged in, and it's one that must not be lost, or at least must be fought valiantly. And I think there would be some evangelicals who would maybe wonder if they agree with that premise, who would say, I don't know. Is Christianity about winning the culture, or is it, I could think of more like a pietist movement. Like, is this about personal piety and we'll let the culture have what the culture has? It seems like kingdom is the idea that's kind of bridging that gap to underwrite the importance of culture. But what would you say to someone who maybe worries that this sounds like a kind of never ending culture war, and that's just maybe not something that they grew up associating the church with, or maybe they've had bad experiences with that? I know culture war can be a bit of a buzzword at times, and I just wonder how you navigate that.
Right. I know that culture wars often focus on the wrong things. Like a lot of conservative Christian commentators will spend hours and hours talking about transgender bathrooms rather than the gospel. So that is a bad temptation. But I think the reality is that politics are all downstream of culture, and culture is downstream of religion. You can't separate culture and religion. That's where the word culture comes from. The root of the word culture is cult, which means religion. You can divide, for example, Europe into historically Catholic countries, historically Protestant countries, historically Orthodox countries, because even though Europe's basically all atheists these days, their cultures are still shaped by their historic religions. Every single culture is built on a certain religion. There is no such thing as a religiously neutral culture. There's this one quote: "I'd rather have cultural Christianity than cultural Satanism." So the question is, are we trying to be culture warriors? Is Christianity just about transforming the culture? Well, not quite. But at the same time, we can't neglect the collective aspect of Christianity. I think, like you said, pietism and also Baptist theology, which is very popular in America, it's very individualistic. It sees the unit of society as basically individuals rather than seeing the society collectively. Part of my like Paedo-Baptist Presbyterian theology makes me think that we're not as autonomous as we think. People do think in groups, societies think in groups. Everyone influences their culture, and everyone's influenced by their culture. Because, and the particular example is, I converted to Christianity due to the influence of Christian friends, right? And even when I saw the culture abandoning God, I was like, it's okay, I still have my Christian friends. But then they abandoned the faith. Why did they abandon the faith? Because of cultural influence. Like, I think people should care about this because it is almost impossible to escape cultural influence. It's like, I don't want to raise kids in a world where, the vast majority of young women are influenced to be radically secular and atheist and stuff. And that's the culture we live in today. So I think if you want to convert individuals, if you want individuals to have a personal relationship with God, there does need to be somewhat of a battle for the culture. It's not the culture is a means to an end. The culture is not the end in of itself. I know that some Christian nationalists see Christianity as a means to improve the culture. I think improving the culture is the means to spread the gospel and to further God's kingdom. So I think culture war, if you want to call it that, matters, but it's a means to an end, and the end is, spreading the gospel.
think it's so important in so many conversations to keep track of what are the means and what are the ends, and this one especially. And for what it's worth, I think that you're tapping into something important when you talked about the power of institutions. I'm not sure if you've ever read, I think it's by James Hunter or something like that, To Change the World, but it's kind of a criticism of evangelical subculture insofar as with so much emphasis on the personal change and the practice of creating parallel institutions, they kind of underestimate the power of enduring institutions, that real societal change often doesn't actually happen solely from the ground up. It almost always happens through centers of power in our traditional institutions, which is why we see something like, liberal seminaries being so important, right? Because the trickle down effect from there is going to be a lot more impactful than if you just, convinced a couple PCUSA congregants to be more conservative. Of course, we need both, but I think thinking about the church and its institutions is a valuable thing. With that in mind, though, I imagine a lot of people, they might even be kind of partial to that idea. They might say, the mainline churches, they have beautiful buildings. They have enduring cultural impact. They have large seminaries with big endowments. They have kind of a disproportionate power culturally than, say, my independent Baptist church down the street, or even the biggest kind of non-denominational church that we have in our city, right? That these mainline churches have a different kind of institutional weight to them. But then they say some of these are just so far gone. I can think of mainline churches I've passed by where it's like we have no creed, but our creed is essentially the whatever cultural thing is going on at the moment. And it just doesn't even seem like, if the building didn't say church on it, if you sat through one of their sermons, you would not think it was a church. Is there ever a point, I guess is where my question wants to land, is there ever a point at which Christians are right to say, like, you know what, this one's too far gone. This denomination, we're not turning it around, and we should focus our energy somewhere else that's going to be more efficient or more fruitful. Is there ever that point, or is it always worth fighting the fight?
Good question, and I get this question a lot. For individual churches, yes. There are individual churches. Not only are there individual churches, I would say don't bother with this one. The strategy of Reconquista, if you want our detailed strategy to actually retake the mainline churches, go to operationreconquista.com. We have a very detailed strategy. We intentionally want to avoid the congregations within mainline denominations that are radically progressive. But the thing is, every single mainline denomination is a big tent. There are conservative PCUSA churches, there are liberal PCUSA churches, there are radically atheist PCUSA churches. You'll find all of them. So what we're going to do is we're trying to strengthen the moderate and conservative PCUSA churches, sending people there, knowing that they're the only ones that are not going to die out in the next generation. So we intentionally want to avoid more radically progressive congregations. We understand that individuals joining a progressive congregation, first of all, they're not going to be spiritually fed. Also, they can't really change much. All the mainline denominations have a spectrum of conservative to moderate to progressive to radically progressive. So we want to encourage people to join churches that are on the more conservative end of the spectrum in those denominations. However, is there a time when we give up on the mainline churches collectively? I would say no. I don't believe we should, because Protestantism, historically, before modern evangelicalism, was always institutional. There was never a time when Protestantism could be separated from institutions. That's what separated the magisterial mainstream Protestants, like Luther, Calvin, Zwingli. That's what separated them from the Anabaptists. The magisterial Reformation was Protestants reforming the existing institutions. The Anabaptists were like, let's abandon the institution. Modern fundamentalism, which evangelicalism is very influenced by, follows much more of the Anabaptist approach to institutions, which is let's be anti-institutional. That's why a lot of broadly conservative Christianity is anti-institutional. Like you said, it does not see the value of institutions. They think we can just evangelize individuals one at a time. The secular left does not try to evangelize individuals. They try to evangelize institutions. You've probably heard of the Frankfurt School and cultural Marxism, like Antonio Gramsci, those guys. They understood how powerful religious institutions were for society, and that's why their first and most primary target was the religious institutions in terms of, replacing traditional religion with cultural Marxism. And that's why they said specifically, we need to hijack the religious institutions. And lo and behold, they hijacked the religious institutions. It's not hard to figure out what happened. So I don't think there is a time when we can give up on these institutions, because I think if we give up on institutions, we're giving up on Protestantism, essentially. If we give up on institutions, if we give up on mainline churches full stop, then we're basically Anabaptists. And some people think that's okay. Some people have, a dispensational rapture theology, says the rapture is going to happen in 3 years. I understand if they don't want to crusade for the mainline churches right now. But those who hold to a more traditional form of Protestantism like me, it's the only way.
You said it's the only way there. I'm curious if people might be thinking there's a third way, as well as perhaps an elephant in the room we'll get to in a bit. But I want to start with the idea of when we say that, we have to kind of restore these mainline churches, or we can't be, or the other option is to be anti-institutional, kind of Anabaptist route. I wonder if say Presbyterian like yourself would say, well, maybe, but isn't there, could I go OPC? Could I go these other kind of institutional churches, but that have split off in the past however many decades? Would you consider that an abandoning of the main line? Like, when you're thinking of retaking mainline churches, do we take back the biggest swath of whether it's the Methodist, the Presbyterian, the Episcopal, etc., the oldest, the most culturally influential? How do you think through that? Because some people might say, well, there's, more denominational churches that are nonetheless still more conservative, but we're saying we got to retake these specific ones. So how do you think through which specific ones to take, again, at the institutional level, not the individual congregations, but why, for instance, stick with PC USA versus just, seeing it out in the OPC or any other options there?
Mm-hmm. To best explain this, I like to use more kingdom analogies. I love N.T. Wright. I love kingdom theology. So the mainline churches, these historic Protestant churches, are like mighty fortresses for God's kingdom that the enemy was not able to hijack. The enemy could just be like any enemy of Christianity. The enemy was not able to defeat these fortresses from the outside. All Christians are soldiers for God's kingdom, responsible for spreading God's kingdom in the world. And the mainstream mainline Protestant churches spread God's kingdom better than anyone. They built the most successful societies in human history. There's a reason that historically Protestant nations are still the most successful countries, because of generations and generations of traditional Protestantism, of institutional Protestantism. These were mighty fortresses for God's kingdom. The enemy could not penetrate them from the outside, but the enemy was able to hijack it from the inside. And then once the enemy did hijack it from the inside, all the people that were loyal to God's kingdom sort of fled out into the countryside. And they tried to build new fortresses, but they had left behind all their resources when they fled. That is why the PCA and the OPC and all these other offshoot denominations, they don't have these historic seminaries with big endowments. They don't have these universities. So another way you could frame the analogy is these offshoots like the PCA and the OPC, they're like very good soldiers, but on like tiny rafts, whereas the PCUSA is like a mighty battleship, but it's been hijacked by pirates. So if we want to make a difference for God's kingdom here and now, we have to retake the battleship, basically. So it's not that the PCA or the OPC are unfaithful or anything. It's just that they are not institutional. And I think Protestantism needs to be institutional. They do not have these institutions. There's a Catholic guy I know, very famous actually. His name is Richard Gallagher. He's like the world's leading expert in demonic possession. And he's Roman Catholic, but he's very disappointed in how these mainline seminaries, they have such big endowments, because generations and generations of faithful Christians donated their whole estates to these seminaries, to these churches, only for people who do not believe in what they donated to hijack them. So all these, atheist seminary professors, atheist pastors, they're living off of Christian money. I think it kind of dishonors the legacy of so many generations of Christians who donated to these institutions to simply jump ship, abandon these institutions, and let people who hate what they believed in live off of their donations and live off of their legacy. It's like another underrated asset that these mainline churches have is cemeteries. Generations and generations of Christians in the same church in like a cemetery in the back of the church. We're just going to let people who don't believe in what they believed in hijack the church. So it's like if you go PCA or OPC, sure, you could be surrounded by more like-minded people, but then you're not really retaking anything. You're just sort of retreating. And sometimes you could say some retreats are justified, but what I ended up seeing is every single time, every single church split, it was always the conservative Christians retreating and the leftists taking over. And the more you retreat, the more the enemy will advance. It's that simple.
We've mentioned a couple times the seminaries and how they fit into this, and I do appreciate your point of the endowments were given by people who would, proverbially be rolling over in their grave to know what their money is being used for today. How does the process differ, do you think, in trying to revive these seminaries, or is it essentially the same? And I know that might be different than the majority of your work, but they do seem important insofar as the ideas from there are going to trickle down into the pastors who are preaching in these pulpits all over the country and are going to be having a kind of outsized impact in informing the leaders of these congregations. So what do you think the strategy is to retake a seminary?
So it might sound hard, but basically the strategy for how to retake X is just how did the progressives take over X? Whatever they did, we can do it unless Christians are somehow weaker than them. Generally, progressives have a much more activist mindset, and this is another reason conservatives often lose. Generally, progressives are a lot more invested in being activists, in advocating for change. When a progressive doesn't like how something works, they advocate for change. When a conservative doesn't like how something works, they basically just complain and leave. So it's very simple. You just have to do what the progressives did. You get involved in the seminaries, you be activists, and basically you don't be J. Gresham Machen. I think J. Gresham Machen, who the founder of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, is the patron saint of retreatism. Basically, Princeton was going in a direction he didn't like. He tried to speak up against it, but as soon as it didn't work, he just left. He was a lot less persistent than the progressives were. So it's basically just two things: be an activist and don't leave. You might remember in 2019 the United Methodist Church had a vote over gay marriage, and the conservatives actually won. The conservatives won in a mainline church. It was, pretty surprising. But the reaction of the progressives was not to leave. The reaction of the progressives was, don't give up, keep trying, keep being an activist, we're going to win this. And then they started making plans to try and sway the vote. And even before they made any victories at all, the conservatives got scared and jumped ship and made the Global Methodist Church and had to pay the progressives to leave. That's how pathetic it was. The conservatives won the dang vote and they left the dang church. So you have to have the mindset of a progressive United Methodist. You have to not have the mindset of a Global Methodist. You have to have the mindset of activists. You have to not have the mindset of J. Gresham Machen. Basically, this might have to do with my leftist background because I used to be a leftist, like I told you. And now my whole deal is I kind of want to use leftist subversion tactics against them because I know how successful they are. And I think everyone can see how successful they are. So I think we need to use those same tactics, but for the kingdom of God rather than for the kingdom of Satan.
That's really interesting. There's a point in this conversation that I think might be important to some of my listeners. It's not something that hits home to me per se, but I can imagine that this sounds all well and good to people like us, or the unmarried 20-something, or even the married 20-something. But then you have kids, and things begin to change quite significantly, or so I hear. And I can imagine, as easy as it is for me to kind of look and maybe throw stones at the movement away from the traditional institutions or the Global Methodists and getting concerned and kind of packing up and moving out, it's easy enough when I'm thinking only of myself and I feel confident in kind of my own orthodoxy or my own way of seeing things. And I think, others do what they may, but I'm going to stick it out. I'd be curious if you've talked to people. I don't think you have kids. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No.
Okay. I wonder if you get feedback from people who are saying like, this sounds great and I'm glad you're doing it, but I've got kids and I can't have them in this church as it's going in this direction. It's just not going to be good for them. And I'm worried about my kids. Do you think that is legitimate, or what? I have to imagine you've gotten that question. So I'd just be curious how you respond to people.
I have, yes. And it is a good question. It's very, very good people are concerned about their kids. There's two things I would say. Like I said, we're not telling people to join progressive congregations. We're telling people to join moderate and conservative congregations within these more broadly progressive institutions. Like when churches left to go to the Global Methodist Church, it wasn't individuals leaving progressive Methodist churches and moving to conservative ones. It was conservative churches leaving the broader denomination. That had nothing to do with what church you're raising your kids in. It was an institutional decision of conservative pastors of conservative churches leaving a denomination. So that criticism would definitely apply if you're asking should people attend progressive churches. But that's not what we're advocating. We're actually advocating against that. We need those progressive churches to die out so the conservative minority can become a majority. At the same time, there are some cases in which some people might have to say, like, I'm in an environment that's kind of hostile to the faith and I have kids. What should I do? Well, remember what the apostles did. The apostles did have kids. I'm not sure if the apostles themselves did, but the apostolic church, the churches of the apostles, the early Christians, they had kids, they had families, and yet they went into the most hostile environments imaginable. They got fed to the lions. A lot of people say, I don't want to live in the cities. The cities are full of disgusting, liberal stuff. I'm moving to the countryside away from everything. That's not the mindset of the early Christians. The early Christians, they went to the pagan cities. They got fed to lions. Suffering for what we believe is the way of Jesus. That is what we're called to do as Christians. Christians are not called to live in safe spaces. Christians are called to go into the most hostile environments because that is what transforms people. And I think the left understands this better than modern Christians do. Leftism is a Christian heresy. Leftism comes from Christianity, but it's just a weird perversion of it. That's why leftism gets some things right, like that we should help the poor, that we should help the oppressed. Those are Christian ideas. I think leftism also took the Christian idea of, going out of your comfort zone and being persecuted for what you believe and sort of living off of that persecution. That's why the early church said it's the blood of the martyrs that waters the seeds of the church. So I think if Christians isolate themselves in safe spaces, which conservatives are doing, God's not going to reward them for that. But if Christians leave their comfort zone, if they go into hostile progressive environments and suffer for what they believe in, God is going to reward them for that.
It is a helpful reminder that the outsized comfort that we're so used to in every area of life today isn't normal, and it's also not what we're called to as Christians. And so I think even in this, as difficult as that may be, and speaking as an outsider to the specific question of having kids, is an important consideration to keep in mind. Before we pivot to the 95 Theses, which I'm really interested in, I mentioned there might be an elephant in the room, and I can already see all of the comments. And I imagine in your head, you can see all the comments that are going to be in the comment section. It goes back to something you said very early on. And you said when you were at the PCUSA church and you got the new pastor in, and all of a sudden, this was not what you believed. It didn't seem like you. You said, I feel like I almost was more like a Roman Catholic than the pastor who was there at that point and the various other people within the denomination. And I can just hear my Catholic and Orthodox listeners saying, yeah, this is easy. The solution is just don't be Protestant and you don't have to deal with this. Problem solved. This, having to pick between, the PCUSA versus OPC versus PCA, like, that's already too many options, and that's just however many we've given. And so I'd just be curious, at some point you had that idea of, man, I'm like closer to Roman Catholicism than I am to my pastor, but you didn't choose to take that route. And we've talked extensively of why you didn't take the route of just leaving the institution. But why not abandon Protestantism for kind of the safe ship of Catholicism or orthodoxy? At least how it might be put in the comments.
Man, I've never gotten that one before. I've never had, yes, I've gotten that more times than I can possibly count. So yes, there is an argument to be made, like, oh, if why not just go Catholic? I did explain how in Protestantism it's difficult to find churches that are both conservative and traditional. Usually you have just one or the other. Why not just go Catholic? Now, you could say Catholicism is starting to get hijacked by liberalism, though not nearly to the same extent that mainline Protestantism is. So, okay, why not go Eastern Orthodox? So I noticed a very interesting correlation. All right. So the more conservative culture is today, and the categories we're talking about is Protestant, Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox, the more conservative one of them is, the less they've actually achieved for society. Um, if you look at the development of different countries, the Eastern Orthodox countries are by far the most conservative, by far the most religious, but also by far the least developed. There was no Eastern Orthodox scientific revolution. There was no Eastern Orthodox Johann Sebastian Bach. There was no classical music that developed out of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Yes, there were classical composers, but they were just borrowing a Western style, like Tchaikovsky. It wasn't the Eastern Orthodox Church that spread Christianity to the ends of the earth. It was Western churches. And the Western Christianity has developed objectively way more than Eastern Christianity, achieved much more for the world. But between Catholic and Protestant has still done more. Protestantism has made the most successful societies in the world, the most advancements in science and math and law and music and all those things. So you have this weird continuum, this weird inverse correlation, where the more successful a certain Christian society has been, the more hijacked it's also been by liberalism. And there's another point you could add to this line, and it's Islam. Islam has gotten the least hijacked out of everything, but it's also achieved less for society than everything. There's been no liberal hijack of Mormonism either. There's been no liberal hijack of the Jehovah's Witnesses. So what I ended up realizing is that maybe the reason Protestantism has been so hijacked by the devil is because Protestantism is the greatest threat to Satan's kingdom. It was Protestantism that made copies of the Bible, that made the Bible the best-selling book in human history. It was Protestantism, it was Protestant missionaries that spread the gospel to Korea, to all of Africa, to many places in Latin America. It was Protestantism that made the most just and fair societies. I think the reason the devil is hijacking Protestantism is because Protestantism is the greatest threat to him. I would say now, because Protestantism has been so hijacked, Catholicism and Orthodoxy are in a much healthier place than Protestantism is today. And that's why we see so many people converting to Catholicism and Orthodoxy today, because Protestantism is sort of in exile. It's alienated from its own institutions. But during the Reformation, it was the opposite. During the Reformation, Catholics kept converting to Protestantism. Whenever a Catholic would pick up a Bible, they would immediately become Protestant, because at that time, it was the Catholic Church that was very corrupt and the Protestant churches that were healthy. So it's a relative thing. It's a historically relative thing. All the major Christian branches have been hijacked at some point in history, but I think Protestantism is being the most hijacked because it has also achieved the most for God's kingdom.
It's a really interesting kind of historical argument there. I think, I don't want to dwell on this, but of course the opposite possibility that people will throw out, and it's a pretty, well documented one, or at least much has been written on it, is that Protestantism hasn't been hijacked because, it's the best one and the devil's attacking it the most. Protestantism has been hijacked because it's within the nature of Protestantism to lead to a skepticism or to lead to kind of this postmodernism. I'm thinking of people like Bradford Gregory and such. I take it you don't find that convincing, but I'd be curious how you approach that optionality there.
Yeah, I don't find that convincing at all because skepticism was started by Roman Catholics. Descartes who kind of started this whole skepticism was a Roman Catholic. You could make the historical argument that Protestants appealed to reason a lot more than the Roman Catholics. Protestants believed that we had enough reason to basically figure out what the Bible says for ourselves. And it was the Roman Catholic Church that said, no, human reason is corrupt. You need to just submit to the magisterium of the church and find out what the church is saying. And that's where skepticism started, because they wanted to sort of decrease confidence in the perspicuity of Scripture and in human reason. A lot of times when Catholics and Orthodox are trying to argue for the necessity of their church, they do it by attacking the truthfulness and the perspicuity of the Scriptures. They try to make the Scriptures seem like this obscure thing that only the church can understand. Basically the birth of modernism, culturally speaking, was the French Revolution. That's a Roman Catholic country. How Protestantism didn't cause the French Revolution. You could say that there's a connection between Martin Luther rebelling against the Pope and also the French Revolution rebelling against the Pope, but that's not enough. That's not enough to draw a connection. So, and you know, the more conservative side of Europe during the French Revolution was Great Britain. Great Britain is the global hub of Protestantism. And Great Britain was resisting the French Revolution, largely speaking. It's still, you know, a monarchy to this day. I'm not even specifically advocating for monarchism. I'm just saying you can't really draw a connection between modernism and Protestantism. I'm not saying it's Catholics' fault either. I think modernism is simply an attack of the devil against the West in general. I don't think you can blame Protestantism or Catholicism. I'm just saying if you try and draw these parallels, you can provide a lot of counterexamples. That makes it all fall apart.
Well, speaking of parallels, I want to talk about your 95 Theses, and they're obviously paralleled to Martin Luther's famous Theses. So you recently submitted, and you along with others through Operation Reconquista, you orchestrated the proliferation of these 95 Theses to several mainline organizations. Talk to me about how this came about and what do you hope to achieve with it?
So in about a year ago, last February actually, I wrote 95 Theses to the Presbyterian Church USA and advocating basic orthodoxy. Like thesis number 1 is Christian ministers must not be allowed to deny that Jesus is God. And I emailed it to every Presbyterian church, every PCUSA church. I got some responses. I got more good responses than bad responses, to be honest. And that was pretty much it. But then once the Reconquista movement really got off the ground, once we had an online Discord community of like 1,000 young traditional mainline Protestants, a lot of people were like, we want to do this for our denominations as well. So then people began writing 95 Theses to their own denominations. There was 95 Theses to the United Methodist Church and 95 Theses to the Episcopal Church. And then someone in our community had this idea, why don't we all collaborate on Reformation Day to distribute the theses to all of our denominations at once? And we did that. We had people emailing the theses to churches all across the country. We tried to email every single mainline church in the country. We missed some because, you know, a lot of these are run by literal dinosaurs and they have not heard of what the internet is. So we couldn't exactly attach a letter to a pigeon and send it to every mainline church. But we hit most of them. And we also taped, or where legal, we posted the theses physically on the doors of churches. And that actually got a better reception. I think they appreciated us actually trudging in the snow to nail our theses there. We didn't nail anything. There was this one guy, and the Christianity Today article talks about this guy. He literally walked through the freezing cold in Denver, Colorado during a blizzard to attach these theses to the doors of churches all over the city. So that's what we did. And we got a ton of media coverage. A lot of people began noticing us. And for the first time ever in history, I saw on, online chat forums, progressives being really scared that conservatives were going to start gaining grounds in their denomination again. And I know that they were scared because bishops and presbyteries in all these mainline denominations got sent out emails warning about us. In fact, my girlfriend actually got interrogated by her pastor because the presbytery interrogated by her pastor asking if she was involved with Reconquista, because their presbytery had sent out an email warning about us. And there already is some persecution beginning, but I think we need to stay with the fight because It's the persecution makes us stronger as long as we don't give up. So ever since then, we've gotten a lot of pastors on our side, and we're beginning to start organizations like the Presbyterian branch of Reconquista started a nonprofit called Presbyterians for the Kingdom, working with pastors who found our movement through the 95 Theses. So yeah, it's been very good.
It sounds really, really good. And I'm sure the media exposure definitely helped kind of grow the grassroots element of it. What are the next steps here? So, for instance, you founded the nonprofit with the Presbyterians. That seems like a very tangible thing. But how do you keep the momentum going? How do you see this through? I mean, obviously, not every day is going to be something that's going to land on Christianity Today. So, for you, as someone kind of at the forefront of this, what's on your mind of how do you take, what has been a nice kind of like flash in the pot there to something that actually stokes an ongoing fire that sees change?
Yeah, the response is build. Simply build things, build fortresses in the mainline institutions that can later fill them once they get hollowed out. So that's what Presbyterians for the Kingdom is trying to do. We're trying to provide very easily accessible theological content for the purpose of training elders in these moderate to conservative mainline churches. We're going to try and get as many people as possible into these moderate to conservative mainline churches so that they can strengthen them. So we're probably not going to do another stunt like the Reformation Day thing. That was a spark to get us started. Now it's time to build. Now it is time to sort of carve out faithful sections of these broadly liberal mainline churches, knowing that they're going to be the only ones left pretty soon. And I honestly think it'll be a domino effect. I think if one mainline church gets retaken, all of them will. And the Reconquista in the Reformed Church of America, which is the historically Dutch Reformed denomination, that's actually going very well. And I think that might actually get retaken pretty soon. I don't want to speak too soon, but I think it will be quite a bit of a domino effect. So it's going to be very hard. And I think it'll be 20 years before we actually see a real shift to the right in these denominations, the theological right, I mean. But what we can do until then is just build up the fortress, build up a strong minority, knowing it's eventually going to become a majority.
That seems to make sense. And I imagine it's something that gets harder before it gets easier for the denominations writ large, because many of these churches are dying out. And they're not going to, like, many churches are going to close their doors. More are going to close their doors probably in the next 20 years than are going to open new doors. I think that's a pretty safe bet within a lot of these denominations. And then it does seem that if people have the staying power, it's a lot harder to pass on a very watered down faith. It's not very inspirational. It's not something you really build your life around too much. Whereas I see conservatives kind of replicating the faith more in their kids and the people around them at a greater rate. And so it seems that as they die off, both in terms of age and in terms of people just don't care anymore, if there are still conservatives around, they have the opportunity to potentially take back some of these
I just want to add one thing.
Yeah.
What you're saying is not just theoretical. It's a well-known fact in all these denominations that the only churches within them that are not dying out are the conservative ones. If you go to a conservative Episcopal parish, it's booming. Tons of young family, tons of young kids. If you go to a progressive PCUSA church, the youngest person is 60, and everyone dies. There's someone dies every week, basically.
A lot more funerals than baptisms in those churches, for sure. So what does success look like? I mean, obviously, in part, it's the denomination gets more conservative. But, in your just wildest dreams for the Presbyterian Church in America broadly, what do you, like, because we have had these institutional splits within the Presbyterian Church, for example. Do you hope that those get healed, or is it more? Okay, so it's once you take back the historic largest one, you hope you bring the rest back into the fold.
Yes, full success looks like reunification. That is actually detailed on our website. We have our complete strategy. We don't need to completely fix the PCUSA right away. We just need to get the PCUSA moderate enough that it can reunify with the PCA and the EPC and ECO and all these conservative things that split off, so that the ministers of those more conservative denominations can fill all the empty pulpits in the PCUSA. The PCA has a massive surplus of pastors. That's why they keep doing church plants in strip malls that nobody asked for. And the PCUSA has a severe pastor shortage, and a lot of churches close because they can't find a pastor. So the solution seems pretty obvious. We just need to push the PCUSA in a moderate enough direction that it can reunify with all these offshoots. There should really just be one Presbyterian church. It's kind of silly, and Catholics are right to make fun of us for this. It's kind of silly that there's so many Protestant denominations. There should be one Presbyterian church. There should be one Methodist church. There should be one Episcopal church, one Lutheran church, and it will really help Protestantism if we have these large institutions. Then we're not going to see people convert to Rome or the East the second they want any sort of traditional Christianity, because Protestantism will have the tradition that it does have, that it used to have, and that it's going to have in the future after Reconquista succeeds.
Well, that seems like a very great place to begin to land the plane here. I really appreciate your time today, Richard. Just
Thank
any
you.
parting thoughts for people that are excited about this vision and they want to kind of get involved in the movement? Where do they go? And maybe what's a piece of advice you would give them for the journey they have ahead?
Yeah, society does not look good for young men these days because a lot of young men are lonely. They don't have friends. They have nothing to fight for. And that's why these traditional types of Christianity, like Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, are appealing to young men. They want tradition. They want to be part of something greater than themselves. But I think the best thing is young men need to fight for their future. So I'm calling on all young men who feel lost, who feel without a purpose, to join this crusade, to fight for our future, to fight for our church, to fight for the gospel, to create a better future for our kids and our grandkids. Because if we win, things will start to get better. If we win, I believe the statistics will turn around and Christianity will start to increase every year rather than decrease every year in the United States. I think this is the adventure that our generation needs, and many friendships and bonds will be formed along the way.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll close here with just a couple of rapid fire questions that I ask all
Yeah.
my guests, and I'll be sure to have links to Operation Reconquista and Redeemed Zoomer and whatever else you'd like in the description down below. But thanks again, and here we go for the final four. So first question, what has been the most fruitful habit or spiritual discipline in your life?
Uh, Communion. That's a kind of easy answer, but it has helped me more than any other thing. I'm not sure if I'd call it a spiritual discipline because it's required, but I'll go with that, sure.
There you go. Outside the Bible, what has been the most impactful book on your life?
I have to start reading. I would probably say some sort of theology book. My favorite theology book is The Mystical Presence by John Williamson Nevin, which details the truly reformed view of the Lord's Supper, that we really receive the body and blood of Christ. That's a great book. It's my favorite theology book outside the Bible.
That's a good one. If you could go back in time, what's one piece of advice you'd give yourself as a new Christian?
The advice I would give myself is look to wise Christians for advice instead of trying to figure it out all yourself. For the first 18 months of being Christian, I didn't read the Bible. I tried to figure it out all out myself. And when I did have questions about the faith, I would listen to people like Dennis Prager or Ben Shapiro, like these pop conservative figures that aren't even Christian. So listen to wise Christians instead of yourself. That's what I would tell my past self.
I like it. Final question. This channel is called Gospel Simplicity. It's often pointed out that the conversations are a bit on the complex side, so we'll finish with, in a sentence or so, what is the gospel?
Yeah, the gospel is the good news about the kingdom of God, that God has become king in Jesus. He has already defeated the powers of evil and death through his death and resurrection. And when he comes back, he's going to consummate his kingdom by restoring all things. All good things will be restored. So right now, it's our job to transform the world in anticipation of that. We join this kingdom by having faith in the King, Jesus Christ, who died for our sins and rose again for our justification.
Richard, thank you so much.